Okay, the next lesson is on forming the contrapositive of a conditional statement. So this is the third and last variation on a conditional statement. So let's first review what we've done so far. So far we've learned the inverse of a conditional statement, which requires you to simply negate the premise and the conclusion. We also learned the converse of a conditional statement, which is formed by simply switching the premise and the conclusion. This should be in your notes, and you can look back in your notes and look at plenty of examples that we did both in your notes and in the videos. And the next thing we're going to learn is the contrapositive. So how do we form the contrapositive of a conditional statement? Well, what we do is the contrapositive of a conditional combines the converse and the inverse. In other words, not only do we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, but we negate both of them. So if you need to put your player on pause, please do so. Take this down in your notes. This needs to be in your notes together with the examples. So let's take an example. If today is Monday, then I eat PB&J for lunch. So what I'm going to do is we're going to switch the premise and conclusion, and we're going to negate both of them. So if I do not eat peanut butter and jelly for lunch, then today is not Monday. Let's take another example. If two lines are parallel to each other, then the two lines never intersect. So see if you can anticipate what the contrapositive is going to be. As you guessed it, if the two lines do intersect, in other words, what we're doing is we're negating never, which means they do, or always do. If two lines do intersect, then they are not parallel to each other. So we flipped the premise and conclusion, and we negated both. Let's take a third example. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. So we're going to take the contrapositive, we're going to flip both the premise and conclusion, and we're going to negate both. If you do not live in Illinois, then you do not live in Chicago. Let's take a fourth example. If the quadrilateral is a square, then it has four congruent sides. So we're going to switch the premise and conclusion. If the quadrilateral does not have four congruent sides, or if it does not have four congruent sides, then the quadrilateral is not a square. Okay, so the question now is the contrapositive true? We found out that the inverse is not always true. The converse is not always true. How about the contrapositive? Well, let's go back to the original conditionals. Assume the conditionals are true. Okay, assume that if today is Monday, then I eat PB&J for lunch. During the summer, during the winter, during the fall, during the spring, it makes no difference. Every Monday I eat PB&J for lunch. Well, if I do not eat PB&J for lunch, could it possibly be Monday? No, it can't, because every Monday I eat peanut butter and jelly, the same boring lunch. So it turns out that the contrapositive is absolutely true. Let's take a look at the next one. So we saw that the statement, if two lines are parallel to each other, then they never intersect. The lines never intersect. We know that this statement is true. That is the definition of parallel lines. The contrapositive is if two lines do intersect, then they are not parallel. Well, if two lines do intersect, could they possibly be parallel? No, they can't be parallel, because if they were parallel, they would not be intersecting. So it looks like this contrapositive is also true. Let's take a look at the third example. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois, and to take the contrapositive, we switched and negated both the premise and conclusion. So we know that there is only a Chicago, Illinois. There's no Chicago, California, or Chicago, Maine. So if you do not live in Illinois, then could you possibly be living in Chicago? No, there's only one Chicago, and that's the one in Illinois, the city in Illinois. So if you do not live in Illinois, then you could not possibly be living in Chicago. So this contrapositive is also true. Let's take a look at the next one. If the quadrilateral is a square, then it has four congruent sides. We know that that is the definition of a square. That is one of the properties of a square. The others we'll learn later this year. Well, if it does not have four congruent sides, could it possibly be a square? Could this quadrilateral possibly be a square? No. So if it does not have four congruent sides, it is not a square. So this contrapositive is also true. So it looks like the contrapositive of a true conditional is always true. Write this down in your notes. The contrapositive of a true conditional is always true. If you need to put your player on pause, please do so. One of the important things to remember is this word, true conditional. Why is that important? Let's see. The contrapositive of a conditional is true only when the conditional statement is also true. Okay, so in other words, the conditional statement must be true. This belongs in your notes. If the conditional statement is false, then the contrapositive will also be false. Put your player on pause if you need to take this down, and then hit play to resume. Let's take an example. If a polygon has 5 sides, then it's a hexagon. Well, what is a 5-sided polygon? A 5-sided polygon is not a hexagon. A 5-sided polygon, if you want to draw one, there's a 5-sided polygon. There's a 5-sided polygon. It is not called a hexagon. This is called a pentagon. So this statement, this conditional statement that we have right here, that is false. So now let's see what the contrapositive looks like. Contrapositive, if the polygon is not a hexagon, then it does not have 5 sides. Well, let's take a look. So let's see if we can draw a polygon that is not a hexagon. Okay, so in other words, let's see if I drew a polygon that is not a hexagon. Does it really not have 5 sides? I don't know. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is my polygon that is not a hex. This is not a hexagon. This is not a hexagon. This says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's supposed to be a 4. So here is a polygon that is not a hexagon. Does this not have 5 sides? No, it does have 5 sides. So because the conditional statement was false, so is the contrapositive false. Here's what we'd like for you to do. For each of these 4 statements below, write each conditional statement, so you have it in front of you, then determine the truth value of the conditional, then write the contrapositive and determine its truth value. Put your player on pause, try to do all 4 of these, and then hit play to resume, and we'll see how you did. Okay, so the first one is, if it rains outside, then the ground is wet. So what should you have gotten as the contrapositive? So we're going to flip and negate the premise and conclusion. So if the ground is not wet, then it's not raining. If the ground is not wet, then it's not raining. Is that true? If the ground is not wet, then it's not raining? Well, yes, because if it rains outside, we know the ground is wet. If the ground is not wet, it could not possibly be raining, because if it's raining, then the ground would be wet. So we know that the contrapositive is true, right? So if it rains outside, the ground is wet. This is definitely true. And if this is true, then if the ground is not wet, it cannot possibly be raining. This must also be true. If it's raining outside, folks, the ground has to be wet unless there's a giant umbrella that is covering the entire city of New York. Let's take a look at the next one. If 2 angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. Okay, well, that is the definition of congruence. So we know that this statement, this conditional statement, is absolutely true, right? And what is its contrapositive? Let's take a look. So the contrapositive is, if 2 angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. Well, we know that this statement is also true, because if 2 angles are not congruent, then they cannot possibly have the same measure, because congruence means they have the same measure. So if they're not congruent, they cannot possibly have the same measure. Let's take a look at another one. If you are studying biology, then you are studying science. Yes, biology is a topic in the field of science. So what is the contrapositive of this? Well, if you are not studying science, then you are not studying biology. That is absolutely true. In other words, if biology is science, and biology most definitely is science, right? That is true. Then if you are not studying biology, if you are not studying science, could you possibly be studying biology? No, because if you were studying biology, you'd be studying science. So if you're not studying science, you cannot be studying biology. So this is also true. How about the next one? If it has 4 legs, it's a cow. Now, if it has 4 legs, it might be a cow. It also might be a cat, or it might be a dog, or it might be a mouse. So if it has 4 legs, it's a cow. Not true. Not necessarily true. It might be true, but it's not always true. If the conditional is not always true, then the conditional is false. What is the contrapositive of this statement? If it's not a cow, then it does not have 4 legs. Well, we know that that's not true. If it's not a cow, that doesn't mean it doesn't have 4 legs. It could be a mouse. It could be an elephant. It could be a giraffe. So the contrapositive is false because the conditional is false. So let's very quickly review what we've learned so far. We've learned the inverse of a conditional statement. We've learned the converse of a conditional statement. And finally, we learned the contrapositive of a conditional statement, which simply switches and negates both the premise and conclusion. All this belongs in your notes. If you need to review, be my guest and check Jupyter for your homework.